Northern England, North Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Much of Scotland will be dry and bright on Thursday. It's Friday, we could see some snow here, but look at this, wet weather. Wales, the Midlands could see some snow on Thursday, pushing into Northern England and Northern Ireland through the day and eventually into southern Scotland. In the south, by Thursday, it will start to turn a little milder, so it's more likely we'll see rain here. Goodbye.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Good evening, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. State of the Nation, tonight. The government has announced new legislation promising to solve the migrant crisis. But does it cut the mustard? I'll be giving my thoughts shortly, and we'll be hearing from the mighty Lee Anderson. A free speech battle took place in Parliament today. The right to protest is once again under threat. We will be speaking to someone who has fallen foul of this new policy, which threatens our basic rights. Plus, do you have a spare £5,000 to fork out on flights for your yearly holiday to Portugal? Well, that might be your future if airlines plan to subsidise their green tech on your ticket.
If prices are going to triple, then by 2050 we are looking at 8 times, 10 times. There's only few people who will be able to travel, the mega rich and the 1%, those with private jets.
So, Vox Populi, Vox Day, send in your views as always, and State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be hearing from our panel, the esteemed historian Dr. David Starkey and the former Labour MP, but still a socialist, Stephen Pound. As ever, I want to hear from you. Get in touch by emailing But all of that is to come. It's been a busy day, and here to keep us up to date is Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thanks very much indeed, and good evening to you. And some breaking news to start this bulletin on GB News tonight. We can tell you that in the last few minutes, the RMT have called off planned train strikes after receiving an improved pay offer from Network Rail. We can tell you union members were due to take strike action on the 16th and the 17th of March. The organisation saying further updates will be given on the national rail dispute in the coming days. Well, the other main news today on GB News is the Prime Minister has addressed potential migrants of the UK by saying if you come here illegally, you can't claim asylum and you can't stay in the UK. Rishi Sunak says the government should be the one who decides who should be in the country and not the criminal gangs. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, earlier admitted it's likely the illegal migration bill may be incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. But at a news conference earlier today, GB News' Tom Harwood asked the Prime Minister if he's ready for any legal challenges.
Already legions of lawyers are preparing to tackle you over this legislation. Firstly, are you up for the fight? And secondly, what's plan B if they win?
Well, look, of course we're up for the fight and wouldn't be standing here if we weren't. But we're confident that we will win. There's absolutely nothing improper or unprecedented about pursuing bills with a 19(1)(b) statement. It absolutely does not mean that the bill is unlawful. We believe that it is lawful, that we are acting in compliance with our international obligations, and we are also meeting our obligations to the British public.
Rishi Sunak speaking earlier on today. Well, Sir Graham Brady, chairman of the 1922 committee, has said today that he's going to stand down at the next election. Sir Graham, who's been a Conservative MP for Altrincham and Sale West since 1997, said in a statement, "Representing my hometown in the House of Commons has been an immense privilege for which I will always be grateful." Now, the police watchdog says it's going to investigate how police handle missing persons reports after a fatal car crash in South Wales remained undiscovered for 2 days, despite the victims being reported missing. The Independent Office for Police Conduct says it's going to examine what information the police had and the steps taken by the force to locate the missing people. 3 young people were killed in the incident, which happened near Cardiff, and 2 others remain in a critical condition in hospital. Many hundreds of people have this evening held a 1-minute silence at a vigil for the 3 who lost their lives. And lastly, parts of northern England and Scotland have been hit by a sudden cold snap, with temperatures forecast to drop to -15 in some regions. More than 4 inches of snow fell in northern Scotland today, and around 8 inches are forecast for later this week. A yellow weather warning for snow and ice remains in place for much of the country, with tonight expected to be the coldest night of the year so far. That's all from me. I'm back in an hour. Now back to Jacob.
Today we heard from His Majesty's Government a bold announcement of new legislation vowing to remove illegal migrants within weeks of their arrivals. A clear statement from the Home Secretary. She said that she could not confirm compatibility with the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, that is overseen by a court that has regularly found against the British government. And indeed, there was a leaked letter that states that legislation is more likely than not, on a balance of probability, the legislation is likely to breach the European Convention of Human Rights. But this is important because there has been a conflict in this country between human rights law and the rule of law. The rule of law is that which is set out by Parliament and has a democratic backing, a democratic support. The European Convention is something that was thought up many decades ago to protect the very basic, simplest of rights, but has evolved because of judicial activism, both in Europe and indeed in our courts, to interfere with the democratic operation of Parliament, and has thwarted the will of the British people. So there's been this tension between the rule of law and human rights law. And that has allowed something that's been going on that is illegal and dangerous to continue, and has encouraged people to come, because the balance has been struck incorrectly. That's the balance between the rights of the individuals who land here and the rights of the country, the community, to protect itself from illegal migration. As the Home Secretary pointed out, possibly 100 million people would want to come here if it were open doors. And so we need, as a country, to retain the right to deport illegal migrants, because the numbers have been getting out of control. Last year, 1 million visas were issued legally, but illegally, there are about 50,000 who came across the Channel in 2022. And those are the ones who were recorded. And as you may imagine, if you've crossed the Channel, you don't necessarily immediately go to a police station and say, I'd just like to say I've crossed the Channel illegally. So those are the ones who get spotted. But some of them are coming from safe countries. So a third come from Albania. But Albania is a safe country. Why are people from safe countries seeking refuge as if they were coming from a war-torn area? And the people who are coming aren't the halt and the lame. 74% of them are males under 40. And that's not surprising, because they need to be fit to carry out the journey, and they need to have the money to pay the people traffickers. People traffickers who are known in Hong Kong as snakeheads, which I've always thought was a wonderfully descriptive term about these bad people who profit, who make money from the misery of those seeking better lives for themselves. And we have to stop them, as well as get the numbers under control, to ensure that we have a system that the British people have confidence in, rather than one that is undermining the belief that we have as a nation in the rule of law. Today, the government's made a bold statement. But that's not the first time this has happened. We've had bold statements before. Will this one prove practical? Has the Home Secretary gone far enough in challenging the European Convention of Human Rights? Will she get a majority in Parliament? Will this country, with a proud tradition of tolerance and kindness and generosity, now ensure that the law is applied against these wicked human traffickers, the ones who dabble their hands in misery? Well, I've got my brilliant panel with me, but I've also got the estimable Lee Anderson, who I'm very pleased to welcome back. Lee, you're Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. You've got to support this policy. You're bound by collective responsibility. Do you, in your heart of heart, think that this time the answer is there?
This is our last chance, Jacob. I think this is... I spoke to Rishi yesterday, and I spoke to Suella about this legislation. This is what we've wanted all along. You know, the idea that people can come here illegally and then get ferried off to hotels is beyond the pale for me. What we've been asking for since we got to this place, or that place there, is if you arrive here illegally, then you have no right to claim asylum, then you are deported to a third country as soon as possible. If we get that right, and we can fight off the ECHR, and that place remains sovereign, because that's the place over there that makes our laws, we should back that 100%. Get a little bit grumpy sometimes when we keep pandering to the ECHR, and a lot of my colleagues do. I hope they've got it right this time, because, like you say, we've marched up the hill before, and we've come back down again. But like I say, in this legislation, we've got bits in there that we've not had before, and fair play to Rishi and fair play to Suella.
They've gone much further than expected. But, Stephen, do you think this is practical, or that we'll get bound up in endless litigation in the European Court?
I don't think it's a question of litigation. This is just a gimmick. There's a huge lacuna in the middle of this. Look, what happens is, just think about the practicalities of it. Firstly, they're saying that they won't deport children until they're 18. So the idea of somebody waiting till they're 18 and then being deported is like the old days of the death penalty, when you had to wait till you're 18 before you got swung off. But look, the real problem here is you're creating a vast world of people in limbo. Because somebody comes here from Afghanistan, from Iran, and we say, no, you have no right to be here. Where are you going to deport them to? Rwanda is a no-starter. The Israelis tried it. They sent 4,000 people there. And how long did it last? It lasted 3 months. It was just a nonsense. So we've got these people...
Why is Rwanda a non-starter? That we're going to be giving them financial support? We're going to be paying for them to take refugees from the UK?
Rwanda is an area which has been racked by civil war and internal genocide in very recent, in our lifetime, in my time when I was in Parliament. It is not a safe place. And anyone who says it is, would actually go and stay there. The Israeli experience was that what happened was that people were getting murdered. murdered and they were murdering. It just simply didn't work. But, you know, can you...
Well, if they're murdering, if they're going there and murdering, we certainly don't want these people in the United Kingdom, do we?
I couldn't agree more, but do we honestly really think...
Can we just,
let me bring David in, because...
just try and go back to the questions that you raised right at the beginning, Jacob? The real problem is, first, this is you and it's you, Jacob, Conservative MPs. The Human Rights Act, which incorporated the European Convention into British law, was a catastrophe from the very beginning. You have been in power 12 years. You have not had the courage to do anything about it. So there is a huge burden, and I think, of guilt that hangs over you. You are actually in government. The fact that it's taken 12 years to recognise this problem, because the situation over the notion of universal human rights, first is it's an intellectual nonsense. When did universal human rights come into existence? It was described as long ago as the 19th century, late 18th century, by Jeremy Bentham. Human rights are nonsense on stilts. But they're disastrous nonsense, because what they do is they give incompatible rights to incompatible people. The result is, therefore, that these rights can only be arbitrated between by judges, when, as you said, proper decisions should actually be taken with the democratic authority of Parliament. In other words, there is a fundamental intellectual catastrophe at the heart of all this.
Contention between human rights and democracy. I don't disagree with that. I do disagree that we've had 12 years to do it, because as long as we were in the European Union, we could not resile from the power of the European Court of Human Rights. That was a treaty obligation. But, Lee, I want to bring you back in on this, because do you think there is a majority in the Conservative Party for us to carve out bits of the convention?
I think there is, Jacob. We've got an election looming in 18 months' time, and this could be our... You know, like the Brexit election was in 2019, this is a clear choice with the electorate, and it's a clear choice with the members over there, and I think the British public have got us on notice. And if we get it right, I think we've got a really good chance of winning the next general election.
But, Lee, isn't there a real problem that there's a very important section of the Conservative Party which is fully committed to the notion of the rules-based international order? Because, remember, all of this comes in part of the catastrophic post-war settlement. The reason why you have the conventions, both the United Nations conventions and the European ones, is they're essentially designed to justify the trials of the Nazis. This is why you come up with this notion of something that goes beyond state power, because what the Nazis...
you have to control state power. You have to control state power because the Nazis...
What you do, you invent something that's in theory supranational.
I want to bring Stephen in, because the Labour Party's always had an internationalist view. It's long been part of its principle. How hard will Labour fight back on this? Will you go into an election, do you think, saying human rights are more important than deporting illegal asylum?
No, of course not, because that's what the Conservatives will say, and and if I was in their position, I would say the same thing. But what we will say is pretty much what Yvette Cooper said today, that this simply doesn't add up, doesn't make sense. If you've got these people who you then allow them into the country, instead of doing the sensible thing and actually keeping them in areas, in enclosed areas where you can actually process them, and then if they have to go back to Tirana, by heaven, get them on the next boat back to Tirana. But the rest of the people...
Sorry, now, Stephen, you're giving the game away. What you're saying is that, in fact, Labour is even more in favour of the rapid removal of immigrants than the Conservatives.
No.
Is that
absolutely
no. Well, right, sorry. I'm just pointing out that I used to many years ago when I was teaching you. There's an
that's one-upmanship.
Absolutely fundamental contradiction in what you're saying.
Stephen, did you learn much from him, or did you just get lectured?
He remembered very little, I think, is the answer. Yes.
Well, listen, let's get things absolutely straight. We're
trying to.
Some scroats from Albania who come here purely because they can work in the black economy here, because we don't have ID cards, we don't have any way of knowing where they are. We ask them to go and stay in a hotel and rely on their inherent honesty to stay there. That is an utter nonsense. They should be going. But
we can't lock them up straight away.
I'm sorry, we can. We shouldn't let them off the plane.
All right. Well, I think you're advocating Tory policy. But Lee, you're going to have plenty of time to talk about this, because you're going to be hosting your own show on GBNews, which is really exciting.
My own show, and yes, I am. I'm looking forward to it, Jacob. It's going to be next month. We start. It's going to be Friday night, 7 p.m. So that's prime time, I think, Friday. We'll have lots of sensible guests on there. Might even have the odd socialist on there as well. Might even get Stephen on there and carry this debate on. And I just want to come back, actually, because at least we've got a plan now, Stephen. We've got a plan to try and sort this out. The Labour Party have got no plan, and they've opposed us at every single stage in the Borders Bill, now the Immigration Bill. And I think coming into the next election, they've got a tough job on their hands.
What do you think about ID cards, Lee?
Okay, I think we're going to have to.
I don't believe in ID cards.
You're going to have to come in on Lee's programme and discuss this further. But thank you very much. It is a great panel, isn't it? With Lee, David, and Stephen. But after the break, the latest free speech battle took place in Westminster today. The right to protest is under threat. Find out after the break. Don't go anywhere.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio,
with the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not
believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts, and thank you. So, Rock says, I think the Tories have had a decade and a half to sort this out, and that we've heard it all before. Rock, you were listening carefully to David Starkey, because that's what he said. Adam rather agrees with you, the legislation is too little, too late. And Neil says, wasn't it a condition of the Brexit agreement that we have to stay under the ECHR? I don't think so, but it is part of the Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland. But today, in the House of Commons, there was a vote in favour of a Lord's amendment to the Public Order Act that seeks to ban any sort of protest within a short perimeter of abortion clinics. It's known as the Buffer Zone Amendment. Naturally, you might think that as a religious Catholic, I broach this subject because I'm of the pro-life persuasion on matters of abortion. But in this instance, you'd be wrong. It's true that I'm someone who takes the teaching of the Catholic Church as absolute and that life begins at conception. If you have a problem with that, you'd better take it up with the Holy Father. But I can assure you that Catholics have thought these matters through for a very long time. The Catholic Church has answers to almost everything, whether it's on euthanasia or eating meat on Fridays. And the Church has spent 2,000 years studying these matters, helped by the great doctors of the Church like St Thomas Aquinas, whose feast day it happens to be today. But that's not why I opposed this amendment. I defend people's rights to express themselves from all sorts of persuasions, no matter whether I agree with them or not. Freedom of speech is fundamental. This legislation has already taken effect in certain councils around the country, which have their own local versions of this policy, but now it's become national. And just yesterday, as you can see, a woman in Birmingham was arrested for silently praying within 165 yards of an abortion zone. As I see it, if you call yourself pro-choice, then that must extend to the choice of others to pray silently in public places. Well, I'm joined now by the woman in question, who was arrested just yesterday, Mrs. Isabel Braun-Spruce. Isabel, thank you so much. Tell me exactly what happened. You've been arrested repeatedly, and is there a reason that you haven't applied to court to vary the restrictions on you, rather than constantly getting arrested? Some people may say, are you doing this deliberately to get arrested and draw attention and promote the issue?
So just to make it clear, I've been doing the work I've been doing for about 20 years, which is offering help and alternative to women outside abortion centres. And many, many women have accepted that help and been very grateful for it. So at the end of last year, I was silently praying outside the abortion centre and I was arrested there for that. Questioned as to what my thoughts were, what I was praying about. And after I was interrogated, I was released on bail, but I was charged with engaging in an act which was intimidating service users, even though there were no service users actually at that time present. But I was fully acquitted of that last month. So I would naturally assume from that, since I'd been fully acquitted, the prosecution offered no evidence whatsoever, that I was okay to go and do the same thing again, which is what I've been doing for 20 years, praying outside the abortion centre. So yesterday I did go and do that. I prayed out silently in my head outside the abortion centre. I didn't engage with anyone. I had no posters, no leaflets. I wasn't even holding my rosary beads or anything like that. I was just literally silently praying in my head. And 6 officers came with a police van and told me I was engaging in prayer, which is an offence. And they said quite clearly, when I said I don't believe prayer is an offence, they said it is.
How do they know that you were praying? It's private prayer. They came along, 6 police, you were standing there, and they said, you're praying. Where do they get the 6 police from? Nobody else gets 6 police turning up. If you have a robber steal from your house, you don't get 6 police. So where did they find them? And how did they know you were praying?
Well, firstly, I would say that some locals that I know do share your concerns in as much as they're saying, yes, there's crime in the neighbourhood that doesn't seem to be dealt with. And yet when there's a woman standing there silently praying, we can suddenly get 6 officers to go and arrest her. But they asked me if I was praying. And I told them, honestly, that yes, I was silently praying in my head. I didn't feel I needed to hide that. But maybe in view of their response, maybe I should have.
They had to have a suspicion that you were praying, whereas you were praying silently. You were just standing there, was all that they could tell, and they arrested you once you'd admitted you'd told the truth and admitted that you were praying and you'd committed a thought crime.
Yeah, as I say, this is work I've been doing for 20 years. So the police may know I've been doing this work for 20 years. I've been helping women, along with many people who support me in that work. I contact the police every time we start doing this kind of work. Whenever we go outside the abortion centre, the police know I go there. So I haven't made a secret of that, and the police may well know that that's why they know my face, because they know I do that work, and I don't feel I should need to hide it. I've had loads of women supporting me, loads of the women that we have previously supported coming forward to say to me, thank you for what you're doing, because without that help, they would possibly have had an abortion which they didn't really want and felt that wasn't really their choice.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Isabel, and thank you for waiving your privacy as well so that you could speak today. But I've also got with me in the studio part of Isabel's representation from the legal advocacy group, Lois McClatchy. Lois, thank you so much for coming in. Do you know of any previous thought crime in this country?
This is the first time, today in Parliament actually marks the first time that a thought crime has been introduced into UK legislation in modern British history. This is the UK in 2023, not 1984, you might think. But unfortunately, we have a situation now in the case, as we've seen with Isabel, and as we'll be seeing more in the coming months and years due to new legislation passed today. We have a situation where one can now be criminalised and faced charges simply for the thoughts they have in their own mind.
And is this, in its origin, just trying to protect women from harassment who are, whether we like it or not, getting a perfectly legal service, and they should be able to go out about their daily business free from harassment?
Yes, let me make this absolutely clear. I, as a woman in my 20s, absolutely stand against harassment of any women anywhere, at any time, at least most of all at a time of emotional distress. And that's not what we're defending here. What buffer zones do is they criminalise that which is already criminal. It's already criminal to harass a woman like that. But they go much, much further, and this is the dangerous point. They criminalise thought and also consensual conversations between two adults. Consensual conversations that would offer information, offer access to services. We know from BBC polling that almost 1 in 5 women who have abortions do so against their will. So there is, or there are many people who would like to know about other options before they commit to an abortion. Would it be financial support? Would it be emotional support? Would it be another service that would help them? So to take away those conversations, those options, that removes choices from women. It's a no-choice move, not a pro-choice move.
But wouldn't it be possible to be more than 165 yards away from the abortion clinic and to do it just as well? And it's the proximity to the clinic that is the problem that the campaigners for abortion have been putting forward.
Well, we know from the testimonies of women who have benefited from offers of help just at the point when they needed it, that they didn't know where to look for these services and were able to have access at that point of need, right at the point that they were considering their future prospects. So we know from their point of view this is important, but also is taking a step back. It isn't right for the government to censor an area of public space, public streets, from thoughts that they simply don't like, they disagree with. If we roll that logic out and take it away from the abortion issue, which can be a little bit distracting in this conversation, because this is a free speech question, a freedom of expression question, a freedom of thought question. If we take that away from abortion and say, what if the government was trying to ban another source of information or another conversation or people who think about another topic? It's pro-life views today that are being censored. But now that we have the precedent that certain conversations can be banned on certain public streets, who knows where that could lead in the future?
And do you think people like Isabel are going to be arrested in greater numbers? And if they're admitting to praying, aren't they inviting arrest? Wouldn't it be easier for them just to say to the police they're not going to answer their question, because then if they're just standing there, they're not breaking the law?
Good policy should never be based on the fact that we should be lying to the police about our thoughts. And in the UK, which is a democracy, a Western democracy, it's frankly shocking that people think that we can criminalise the thoughts within the privacy of our own minds. In Isabel's case, when she went to court to face criminal charges, the prosecution were able to offer no evidence because there was no evidence, because how can you prove a silent thought? But nevertheless, she had that ordeal of going to court, and here she is again having to face an arrest again. So this new law will unjustly have more innocent people have to go through this ordeal simply because of their thoughts, their silent beliefs, or their willingness to help women at a time of crisis.
Well, the rosary used to be illegal in the Elizabethan times when the Catholics were persecuted, and I was certainly noted that Isabel said she didn't take her rosary because she didn't want to be particularly confrontational. But thank you very much, Lois. Thanks so much for coming on. A spokesman from the West Midlands Police said, "We arrested a 45-year-old woman on suspicion of breaching a public space protection order, PSPO, yesterday, following complaints from members of the public. The woman was advised to leave the area and refused before being issued with a fixed penalty notice. When she refused to leave again, she was arrested. She has now been bailed while statements are taken from residents and people working in the area." Still ahead, we'll be dragging my mischievous panel back into the studio for a net zero debate. I'll be praying silently that you'll join me after the break.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your mail mogs. Now, we've had one from a rather pedantic Daniel, who says, Jacob, St Thomas Aquinas' feast day is on the 28th of January. You are wrong. I'm disappointed. Well, Daniel, I'm afraid you're a modernist. Under the old rite, today is the feast of St Thomas, but because it always falls in Lent, in the new rite, it was moved, you're quite right, to the 28th of January, but it may not surprise you to know I prefer the old Tridentine rite. So I'm glad we've cleared that up. And as it's the feast of St Thomas, my son Thomas asked for more time on his iPad, and I've given it to him as it's his feast day. Jane says, Jacob, this is just a means to try and protect vulnerable women, so she's in favour of stopping silent prayer. And Philip says, I think it's a tough one, balancing the rights of free speech with the rights of women seeking help. And I agree, these things are always balances, but free speech is important. So, new research from the Travel Foundation suggests that if we want to meet net zero targets by 2050, passengers will have to subsidise the cost of expensive eco-friendly aviation tech by forking out first-class prices for short-haul flights. But if prices are to treble, then your well-earned holiday to Alicante in the school holidays will become £5,200, or your weekend trip to Budapest becomes £1,200 instead of £400. And it's not hard to imagine that your children might not be able to afford to go abroad by 2050, because taking out a second mortgage on your home for a short trip to the continent just isn't feasible. So on that note, Vox Populi Vox Dei, we asked you, the people, will net zero be the end of low-cost travel? And the people have spoken.
No, travel is ingrained in our society, it's ingrained in our mindset. We like to go on holiday. We get rubbish weather here, so the only way we're going to get good weather is by going on holiday, so air travel is definitely here to stay.
Literally 2 days ago looked at a trip to Barbados, which is coming in at $8.5 grand, which would have 2 years ago probably cost about $3.5.
I can see people paying $1,500, $2,000 and $3,000 to travel for short holidays to Spain and Portugal.
I'm studying here for my degree, so in the future it would be a shame for students who are trying to study abroad and get an opportunity in life to really excel in their career. So I feel like climate change, if it were to impact opportunities of students studying abroad, it would do so negatively.
Back with me are my brilliant panel, the esteemed historian, Dr. David Starkey, and the enormously engaging but socialist former Labour MP, Mr. Stephen Pound. Well, he's quite a social socialist, it has to be said. Stephen, do you think it is reasonable in the effort to get to net zero to make cheap travel expensive travel?
I think there's a certain justification. Look, whether it's going to happen or not, I don't know. I mean, my children are 32 and 34, and nothing could have kept them from Magaluf or Ayia Napa. I think they would have got there somehow. That's the reality. But look, the thing is, that this idea of a holiday being somewhere where you go to is a sort of comparatively modern construct. I think Thomas Cook started temperance outings. And I think the first ever outing on the London Underground was actually to see a public hanging. Which is a shame Lee's not still here. He probably would have been in favour of it. But that was, of course, the privatised London. But look, one of the most polluting forms of transport is ocean vessels, ocean ships, and which is a bit of a worry to people of my age who look to cruises as a rather a good thing. What I'd like to see is people realising that there are very, very good holidays to be had at home. And the idea that you have to travel to find... travel broadens the mind, it broadens, a number of things. There's no question about that.
Oh, these insufferable, tedious pieties. What you're really saying is that you want us to go...
I want to go hop picking, that's what I want.
That's right. You want us all to settle down, stay at home, avoid spending things, go back to being neo-peasants tied down to our villages. I believe in a conservative modernity. I believe in improvement. I believe in broadening of horizons. I think there is this self-flagellating, I know you Catholics tend to be rather keen on that, but this self-flagellating quality about the whole ecological movement. It is, remember, the entire foundation of where we are now. The technology, the lights, the comfort, the broadcasting is cheap fuel. We're going back to the 18th century. We escaped from windmills. We are rapidly going back to windmills. And we must face the truth. Net zero will involve a terrible cost in freedom, in opportunity, in lifestyle, in everything that we've come to take for granted. And there's a fundamental dishonesty in not admitting it.
I would say the alternative. Stephen, what I want to ask is, can you get anyone to vote for this? You and I have both been successful at elections. We've both been in Parliament. I still am. Do you think constituents will vote not to have cheap holidays, and therefore can governments do this even if they want to?
They don't need to. Hold on. Because we've always... Sorry.
Let Stephen get a word in edgeways. Come on. We'll come back to you, David.
I think, look, I always used to say that, my constituents are more worried about 8:30 than 2030, and, they tend to think about the immediacy. But the reality is that we've got snow in London tonight. We've got bizarre weather that's happening. We had the driest February on record, the hottest summer. Look, I think no serious person can deny that there is something pretty frightening going on with the climate of this world. We've got to do something about it, and I don't think anyone can. And I think if actually taking holidays closer to home or even at home is part of that solution, I could sell that on the doorstep.
I think you couldn't, and the point that I was going to try to make...
Let's try it out,
your question was wholly misconceived, because you have got absolutely nothing to do with climate change policy. That is dealt with by an unelected committee sitting under the Lord Debden, and you politicians sit there, beg to be told what to do, and you do it. There's no intervention of democracy whatever in this process. And indeed, it's one of the fundamental problems with the whole way in which we are governed. You have nothing to do with the setting of interest rates. You have nothing to do with something as fundamental as climate change. You've nothing to do with the operations of people talk about the problems with planning. That's one of the principal reasons is Nature England under Tony Juniper. These absurd rules about bats and news. There is no... So it is a really important point. There is no democratic intervention in these things.
Can I just say there is? Look, let's have a couple of examples. 25, 30 years ago, we used to have a thing called acid rain. Acid rain would sweep in from the east. It was decimating forests in Scandinavia. The European Union, a sensible organisation, legislated against that, and particularly in filters
I thought we were talking about democracy.
There is. We actually elected people to the European. Another good example.
Oh, you are so funny. You are a parody of the position.
Another good example is lead in petrol. I mean, we now know that without any doubt, lead in petrol was causing damage to young people's brains. By legislation, by elected legislators in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, we banned it. We can do something about it.
This is absolutely true. And Lord Brooke, when he was Home Secretary, brought in the Clean Air Act. So, yes, democratic legislators can do things. But I just don't think that voters are going to accept, in spite of what David is saying, a system where they can't have their cheap choice. They look at the rise of UKIP. When people are told they get no choice, they vote for somebody else. That's the strength of democracy. And politicians will come forward.
UKIP simply terrified the Tories. UKIP never got more than...
Ah, but it changed policy, didn't it? And we left the European Union. And now the place behind me actually has real power once again. We could not...
Don't use it. You're frightened.
Well, the Home Secretary announced that we were going to use it today, which is something we would not have been able to do in the European Union. We're going to have to finish. You're going to have to go on Lee's show and discuss this with him next week. But thank you both. My panellists are great fun, and I hope we see them back next week. Coming up next, it's the latest developments in the search for the origins of the COVID-19 virus. Was it a pangolin? Was it a bat? Or was it from a lab? Find out after the break. We're back in 3, and I'm...
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank,
fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
Welcome back to State of the Nation with me, Jacob Rees-Mogg. You've been getting in touch with your mail mogs. So, Leslie, unfortunately, net zero will see the end of lots of things we took for granted unless we stand together and refuse to put up with it. But Jack says it's a necessary evil. We all have to do our bit for the planet. Well, my next guest is somebody we could talk about that with, but today we're going to discuss something else. Many would argue that the ground zero for the COVID-19 pandemic was none other than the Chinese city of Wuhan, the world centre for the study of exactly the type of virus that caused the outbreak. For the 16 years leading up to the pandemic, teams from the Wuhan Institute of Virology had been visiting remote caves in Yunnan hunting for coronaviruses carried by bats that might be infectious to humans. The Wuhan scientists' aim was to find out more about threats of coronaviruses, but their methods potentially led to a real risk that they could trigger a pandemic. It's always been plausible that the highly infectious COVID-19 could have escaped from the Wuhan laboratory or been carried back to the city from one of the bat caves by an infected researcher. In the 3 years since the pandemic broke, this theory has distorted much of the public debate about where it began. Well, I'm delighted to have with me Matt Ridley, Lord Ridley, to discuss this. Matt, you've written about this extensively, and when the pandemic started, there was a desire to find somebody to blame, and there was a lot of blame put on China before there was any evidence. I wonder if you could take us through what you think happened and what might have happened instead, what the options are.
Yes, when I first heard about it, I looked into it, I talked to some virologists, and I fairly quickly became convinced that this was just a normal pandemic that had begun in a wet market, and it was wrong to suspect the laboratory. And that's what, Donald Trump and so on were making it sort of slightly worse by accusing that prematurely. But it very quickly became apparent that that wasn't the full story. Because on the one hand, no evidence emerged to indict that market. There was no infected animal in that market. The Chinese authorities tested 188 animals of 18 species in that market. Not one of them was infected. And the head of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in Beijing, eventually said in May of 2020, we don't think it started in the market. Now, so that was quite a surprise.
Can I just check that in previous pandemics that have come from markets, infected animals have been found, so it would be reasonable to expect.
Correct. In both the original SARS outbreak in 2002-03, but also a later outbreak in 2004 when a restaurant with an infected civet cat started another thing. It was very quickly established that there were infected animals in the market and that the early cases were food handlers and animal vendors. And again, no pattern of early cases connected with the market in the same way. There were infected people in the market, but it was a pretty random distribution. So the alternative possibility that a bat coronavirus pandemic beginning in the city with the world's biggest bat coronavirus laboratory and with its closest relative, a virus called RATG13, turning up in the Wuhan Institute of Virology itself, began to be a reasonable hypothesis that needed looking into. Now, I looked into it more and more, and I eventually reached the conclusion that this was actually more likely than the market.
And it's not an irrational thought, it's not a wild conspiracy theory, because am I not right in thinking that there was an outbreak of foot and mouth in this country that came from a UK laboratory? So even UK laboratories have sometimes been responsible for outbreaks of disease where they haven't followed proper protocols.
Yes, there's been lots of outbreaks from laboratories. There was an outbreak of brucellosis in China just before the pandemic, which was traced to a vaccine production facility which had used the wrong kind of disinfectant. But in the case of foot and mouth, 2007, there was an outbreak on a farm in Surrey at a place called Pirbright, which was 13 miles from the world's leading reference laboratory for foot and mouth viruses. Now, nobody said, well, that's probably just a coincidence. They immediately began to investigate, and they very quickly found out that a contractor had mended a broken pipe at the laboratory and had then gone straight to that same farm to do another job. So if we had been allowed to be fully transparent about what was happening in Wuhan in the last 3 months of 2019, we might have been able to pin down exactly what happened. And it's not impossible we could still find out.
And how would that help us to know where it came from? Because obviously it's all happened, and by the time it had leaked from the laboratory, if that's where it came from, it spread quite quickly. Would we have been able to reduce the pandemic, or is it something we can simply use to learn for future?
Well, just to give you an example, up until the 18th of January 2020, the Chinese authorities were insisting you could only catch this virus from an animal. And that was because their assumption was it was in the market. Now, already by then, healthcare workers were catching it from patients and from each other and so on. So that was clearly untrue. But they stuck to that line, and the World Health Organization stuck to that line too, right up until maybe the 14th of January. It's the middle of January anyway. And so, yes, if we had suspected human transmission from the word go, and one of the points is that the work going on in this laboratory involved human cells and humanized mice. So they're infecting bat viruses into mice with human genes. Now, that is training the virus to work out how to attack human bodies. And so that will explain why the virus was so extraordinarily efficient at infection from the very beginning, unlike SARS, which really struggled to spread among people, which is why it was possible to contain it.
And so China was admitting that they were likely to be the source of the coronavirus because they thought initially it was the market and it was transmitted through animals. It was simply they didn't get the right place of origin for it. So it wasn't a sort of massive cover-up, it was a mistake rather than anything more nefarious.
Yes, I think people who say, well, it's rather racist to accuse the Chinese of starting this pandemic, it's just as racist or not to say that it started in a market as to say that it started in a lab. You know, I mean, they're both in China. Quite quickly in 2020, the Chinese started saying, the authorities started saying, actually, we think it came in from abroad on frozen food. And the World Health Organization endorsed that theory. Now, that was ridiculous. Nobody believes that. It would have turned up in lots of other places, in lots of other cities and lots of other countries, and in places where the frozen food was coming from, after all, but it didn't do that. So that really was a red herring. But the two possibilities, the market and the lab, were both on the table from the start, and they were very quickly trying to suppress the idea that it could have come from the lab. And I think that was a big mistake.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's really important to be able to discuss these issues rationally, to try and come to an educated conclusion. So I'm particularly grateful to Lord Ridley for coming on. But that's all from us. We'll be back tomorrow night from 8 p.m. Up next, it's Patrick Christys, who's in again for Dan Wootton. Patrick, what have you got in your box of surprises for us tonight?
Well, another fantastic show, Jacob. Thank you very much. I was going to say it didn't take long for the media to get stuck into Rishi Sunak's plan, did it? But, of course, Robert Peston was asking the questions, and that takes forever. I will talk about media bias when it comes to the migrant crisis, Jacob. You take care. I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful, Patrick. But the weather sounds as if it's going to be a little inclement. That's what we're getting tonight next, but I'll be back tomorrow at 8. See you then.
Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Snow and ice warnings are in place for the rest of this week, issued by the Met Office. Check out the Met Office website for more details on those warnings. But here's what's happening. We've got a weather front just brushing southern areas as we go through Tuesday night and Wednesday. And they are likely to provide a mixture of rain, sleet and, in some places, some heavy snowfall over the next 24 hours. So a wet night across the south. Snow showers in northern Scotland. They'll be easing, potentially quite icy in Northern Ireland as well, but also icy in the south as this wet weather comes in. In between, large chunks of the country, clear and cold. -4, -5, even in towns and cities.
maybe minus 15 through some rural parts across Scotland. So a cold, frosty start to Wednesday, but a wet start in the south. Covering of snow as possible, a centimetre or two as we go through the day. Probably easing for a time across the southeast, but then we'll look at another pulse of wet weather coming into the southwest that could produce some heavier snow during Wednesday afternoon into South Wales, southwest England, and scooting further east later on. Again, for a good chunk of the country, tomorrow's just a sunny but cold day, 4 or 5 the high, not as many snow showers in northern Scotland, but a greater risk of seeing some snow across South Wales, the South Midlands, southern counties of England during Wednesday evening time. We could see 5 centimetres of snow in places, maybe 10 in some spots, particularly high ground. It all starts to pull away as we go through Wednesday evening. One area we're concerned about then, but then another area as this next low comes in further north, the potential for some heavy snow on Thursday and into Friday. Parts of northern England, North Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Much of Scotland will be dry and bright on Thursday. It's Friday, we could see some snow here, but look at this wet weather. Wales, the Midlands could see some snow on Thursday, pushing into northern England and Northern Ireland through the day and eventually into southern Scotland. In the south by Thursday, it will start to turn a little milder, so it's more likely we'll see rain here. Goodbye.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9,